Hello, and thank you so much for joining Atlantic Council in New York City series. We are here today on the sidelines of United Nations General Assembly. My name is Olga Hakova. I am a Deputy Director for European Energy Security at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. And thank you to the audience here in person and those joining us from across the globe. Today's event is very special. It is dedicated to how the transatlantic energy security cooperation can help with forging a resilient future in this very unique time of this new geopolitical era. And when we think of leadership, when we think of consistent and unwavering leadership on European and transatlantic energy security, Director General Jørgensen comes to mind. Director General has been dedicated, and her career and the Commission's efforts have skillfully navigated reaching climate targets while also securing the energy systems through a variety of creative legislative tools, decisive sanctions to keep malign players out of European energy markets, and partnerships. But these mechanisms and these tools are only as good as their implementation. And Director General, of course, has been on the forefront of facilitating this implementation, working with US partners, working with member states on delivering on this robust vision of resilience, security, and net zero. I'm pleased to say that Director General's remarks, keynote remarks, will be followed by a fireside chat between Director General and Ambassador Pyatt, who is a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. He is also a Senior Managing Director of Energy and Critical Minerals at McLarty Associates. However, Ambassador Pyatt really requires no introduction, knowing his incredible work and his legacy on US-European diplomacy and working on these issues at some of the most challenging times in European energy security and against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions. And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Director General on stage for your keynote remarks. Thank you so much, Director General.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the kind introduction. Ambassador Pyatt, Jeff, great to see you again. Thank you very much for joining and for giving an opportunity to continue the transatlantic conversation, the dialogue, the partnership, the cooperation that we have been building, and that is such an essential part of our security strategy and of our broader strategic approach to geopolitics. In one of the earlier events today, somebody opened by saying that everything at this year's General Assembly, wherever you go, the focus is on geopolitics or AI. And so I will start with the geopolitics and I will make my way to AI as well, which is another challenge where transatlantic cooperation is going to be important. But if I start with the geopolitics and where we are in Europe, the Russian invasion into Ukraine 3.5 years ago has been framing of a lot of our policies, a lot of our approaches, including, of course, the transatlantic cooperation. As will be known to everyone, I think, we were highly dependent on Russian energy, in particular Russian gas, before the invasion on the 24th of February, just 3.5 years ago. 45% of our gas came from Russia, 50% of our oil came from Russia, and a very significant share of our coal also came from Russia. Now, the gas dependence was the most dramatic one because this was pipeline gas that brought energy to a significant part of European industry and European homes. That gas was obviously lost from global markets when it was lost from Europe. Being pipeline supplies, it had nowhere else to go. So the impact on global markets was equally significant and dramatic when we look at the price developments in 2022 and the impact not just on Europe, but really on global markets. For us, the reply was clear. We wanted to repower, to get rid of, to phase out this dependence on Russian energy. We immediately or quickly applied sanctions to oil and coal, and that is essentially out of our system, with a very small exception for 2 countries in Europe representing 3% of the overall oil consumption. And with natural gas, markets took care of some of it, infrastructure took care of some of it, and business decisions facilitated by governments and our strong transatlantic cooperation that helped replace the Russian gas by gas from other sources, and most notably LNG. We became, over just a few years, the single largest importer of LNG globally, the biggest market. The US became our single largest supplier, and we your largest customer. So a significant shift in global energy market and global gas markets, and a shift that has enormous potential for further developing the transatlantic partnership, but also very significant security implications, and one that I hope will help set a framework and a pathway and a cooperation going into the coming decades. Certainly for us, the phasing out of Russian energy is a lasting phase out. It is not a temporary block due to the war. It is a decision that reliance on imports of fossil fuel from Russia is a risk to our security. It's a risk to our resilience. And that brings me to my second point, that of the energy transition. For the European Union, as net importers of fossil fuels, the energy transition is obviously about climate and climate neutrality in 2050. That is our target, and we will be staying the course on that target. But it is as much about our security and our competitiveness. We're not significant producers of fossil fuels, and that import dependence has proven critical, dramatic to us over the last few years. And so the transition is about relying more on homegrown, secure, clean energy, as fast as possible and as much as possible for the security, for our competitiveness, and of course for the climate and for global emissions. So that is what is driving our transition and the significant investments that we are carrying out, and having put in place a clear, stable, predictable regulatory framework that confirms our 2050 target and confirms and facilitates the pathway towards that. But the pathway towards that is one that is more complex and that has an energy system that will require all technologies. All technologies out there will be relevant for the energy transition and beyond. And that brings me to my third point. What is the role of the transatlantic trade relation on energy, the very significant partnership on LNG in particular, but also on nuclear and related technologies? We are going to need natural gas in our energy system for the coming decades. And natural gas now, for us, means LNG. So we will continue to be a significant player, a significant importer of LNG from global markets over the coming decades. You will have seen European companies engage with American suppliers. We, from the governments, have been engaging with both the US administration, but also with US companies to make sure that the frameworks we have in place, the regulation that frames the transition and shapes the transition, that all of that regulation, those frameworks are conducive to a continued strong transatlantic partnership and transatlantic trade and investments in the energy sector, including LNG. You will have seen that reflected very clearly in the agreement that was reached earlier this summer, the framework agreement on trade and investment, where energy is, of course, one of the centerpieces and one that, again, will help continue to shape our common security, our common economic development and growth, and the global framework around it. And that brings me to AI, which is one of the factors that will be determinant in our security and in the geopolitical context. AI, all the technologies that are needed for the energy transition and beyond, all the different components, supply chains, value chains, critical minerals. What we do see there is a common concern linked to the significant concentration of supplies, of value chains, of processing, of minerals. That concentration, that level of control by a single supplier is a shared concern. And so another topic where the transatlantic partnership and transatlantic cooperation will be important to help find common solutions to the benefit of both the US and the European Union. And so coming to this event and having a conversation with Ambassador Pyatt and with Atlantic Council and everyone here, I do think that we can approach the conversation about geopolitics and the transatlantic partnerships with on the one hand, a high level of ambition, but also a degree of comfort, having reached the understanding and the clarity amongst each other that this partnership is one that will bring us forward for a more secure global environment in the energy transition, which means different things depending on where you are. For us, the energy transition means more clean energy, renewables, and nuclear. In the US, the energy transition is different. It is about energy abundance and domestic supplies, but those two happen to be highly complementary, and so again, a good framing, a good context for the transatlantic partnership, and one that we look forward to engaging in, and that I look forward to discussing with you here today. Thank you very much.
So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this spectacular venue that the Atlantic Council has put together. So, Director General, you talked in your remarks about the extraordinary progress that we have seen in the European energy security situation since 2022, and the leading role that especially American LNG producers have played in this regard. I've said in Washington that I think this story hasn't gotten enough attention. It was very powerful for me to read President von der Leyen's State of the Union address, her emphasis on Europe's war of independence, and then the strong focus on ending dependence on Russian energy in all forms. Just last week, we heard Energy Commissioner Jørgensen declaring Europe's determination to implement that decoupling in full by the end of next year, which is an ambitious and welcome goal. And I will also remember Commissioner Jørgensen speaking at the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference in Rome last summer, where he made the point very sharply that at a moment when Europe is helping to fund Ukraine's defense of its sovereignty, Europe cannot be in the business of funding the Russian war machine with energy payments to the Kremlin. So, given the historic importance of this shift and the effort it has taken, take us inside that decision a little bit. I mean, obviously, political leadership was a key feature here, but what were the hurdles that had to be overcome, and what do you anticipate between now and 2026 when that decoupling happens? And then, if I may, talk a little bit also about the restrictive measures side of the equation. And I think in the Biden administration, we always said that it wasn't necessary for Europe and the United States to move in lockstep. We didn't always have to mirror each other's sanctions measures, but we needed to mirror the direction of travel. So what would you seek from the Trump administration as Europe moves ahead in its efforts?
Thank you very much for the very, very good question. And if you allow me, I would actually take us back to early 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and when the crisis started. And actually, even before the 24th of February, it was very clear from global energy markets that something was happening. Supplies to Europe from Russia had been decreasing very significantly. Prices were up. And when we looked at our gas storage facilities in Europe, these are the gas storage facilities that will bring us through a cold winter. They were not full to the extent they would normally have been, and so something had been happening. Notably, the gas storage facilities that were operated by Gazprom, the Russian energy company, they were technically empty. So clearly, there was a readiness as we saw in early 2022 at the peak of winter. So at that stage, we decided to look at this level of dependence of 45% and see, well, how do we start bringing it down? We knew that bringing it down in a secure way, in a way that would protect our competitiveness and our role in the world, that required us to align with longer-term strategic objectives. And so energy security is one strategic objective, and that means that level of dependence would have to be removed. That level of dependence on any one supplier is not acceptable. It's not secure. We're not resilient. So that was the first. A second strategic objective was our objective of climate neutrality and the energy transition towards 2050. So we agreed that however we would manage this situation, address the crisis, we wanted to do it in a way that aligned with these objectives, with the energy transition, again, because the energy transition is also part of the energy security. So we agreed for ourselves, how do we approach this crisis in a way that aligns with our strategic objectives, including the strategic objective of a common European energy market and close cooperation, because that is the smartest way to go about it. And Repower EU was born out of those reflections and that clearly stated objective to get rid of this dependence on Russian gas. Repower EU rests on 3 legs. It's about replacing the Russian molecule with other molecules from reliable suppliers, and that's the US LNG has been the most significant shift. We've seen other shifts, other suppliers increase, but the single most important one has been the US LNG. The second leg is to accelerate the build-out of renewables and clean energy, to replace some of the molecules with clean energy wherever that is possible. And then the third is our energy efficiency, our energy savings. If we can be smarter about how we use the energy we have, well, that can also replace some of the Russian molecules. And so, interestingly, over the last few years, a lot of molecules have been replaced by LNG, but quite a significant share of the molecules have been replaced by renewable energy or by energy efficiency. Now, a lot happened in that time, and I think the results speak for themselves. We are gone from 45% dependence to 15% dependence. But we could also see that those remaining 15% are stubborn. So unless we do something from the government side, set a clear legal pathway as well, it simply is not going to happen. And that was the reason that we made a proposal earlier this year to Repower EU, so a regulation that will phase out Russian gas supplies in particular and phase them out for good. The reason for that is energy security. And that's the legal basis, that's the framework, that's the approach. It's long-term energy security, it's a systemic approach, it's a structured approach, and it will stay. At the same time, what we do see is that maybe we could actually do more and do more faster. The question of the funding the war machine. And that is where sanctions, the coercive measures, the restrictive measures come into play. They were announced just last week. Our suggestion to put in place sanctions on the remaining Russian LNG in the European system. So the two coexist. One is about long-term energy security, a systemic approach, a structural approach, and the other one is a coercive measure, a sanction to address the war and to avoid funding the war machine also in the immediate term. So that is the approach we're taking going forward.
That's terrifically useful. Thank you. You talk a lot about energy transition, and one of the realities of the energy transition is we're going to need a lot more cobalt, lithium, nickel, zinc, copper, rare earths. I'll always remember when we were all together in Brussels, Secretary Blinken leading the US delegation for the US-EU Energy Council in 2023. Then Energy Commissioner Simpson made the point that we must not trade an era of dependence on Russian fossil fuel for an era of dependence on Chinese critical minerals. And I think this is another area where there's been tremendous progress in the transatlantic conversation about how to reduce China's domination of the supply chains for so many of these clean technologies. Solar cells, battery storage, wind nacelles, you name it. In this regard, how do you think we're doing? And I should also note, I was watching very closely this week, there was an announcement by a Ukrainian company, Ditte, for the deployment of a new battery energy storage system in Poland, where the technology will come from a transatlantic joint venture, Fluence, a company with its roots in AES in the US and Siemens in Germany, which is a perfect example of, I think, this larger agenda of transatlantic collaboration. But how do you think we're doing in this regard? And again, are there steps that you would hope that the Trump administration would take? And I will say one thing that has been striking to me since leaving government, the issue around China supply chains in the clean energy space has, if anything, grown in attention in Washington. So it seems like a natural area for convergence across the Atlantic.
Yeah, those are really very good points. I think it's a glass half full, half empty type situation. On the one hand, a lot has been happening. We see investments into the clean technology and other technology value chains. We see more investments into the mineral sector and into alternative technologies. So a lot has happened over these last few years. I think the analysis is so compelling that it is impossible not to do something. What we've done in Europe is to give ourselves some clear resilience frameworks, both in industrial sectors, the Net Zero Industry Act, and in the critical minerals sector, the Critical Raw Materials Act, where we set certain resilience requirements that are necessary and that will support the longer-term development of these sectors and facilitate investments. But those approaches rely both on resilience, domestic investments and production in Europe, and as much as that, they rely on international partnerships. There is no way any of us, the United States or the European Union, can remain resilient and competitive and secure without working together, including in the sector of critical minerals and the technologies linked to both clean technology, but also technologies linked more generally to AI and other technological developments. And so, yes, the transatlantic cooperation is important also in that sector. We are challenged by the realities of markets, that if one player has a degree of concentration that we see here, then that comes with an ability to manipulate markets, to change markets, and that makes it more difficult to invest. So one of the other aspects that we need to look at is how do we help de-risk investments? How do we make sure that there is clear offtake and long-term perspectives for investors? And again, cooperating on that, the United States, the European Union, but also like-minded countries, is an important part of our secure future.
Super. Well, I was pleased to run into Jacob Hilburn, who will be the new Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the State Department once he's confirmed, and we talked about exactly this issue. So count on support from the outside. You also talked about the continuing role that oil and gas will have to play in all of our economies as we navigate through this period of growing demand. In this context, one of the issues that's gotten some attention in Washington recently surrounds the regulatory framework. All of our companies, certainly when I talk to our super majors in the United States, you listen to Chevron or ExxonMobil or EQT and Toby, as we were talking to last night, there's a clear desire to demonstrate the progress that the U.S. industry is making in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of the molecules that the world will continue to use, and a willingness to continue to invest in that area to demonstrate that we can deliver the world's energy requirements in a sustainable fashion. This has gotten caught up in the conversation around CSDDD in the European Union. You and I talked earlier about the likelihood that this is an issue that officials can negotiate and work their way through. But give me your sense of how the conversation looks in Brussels. And when you hear Secretary Wright or some of our corporate leaders expressing concerns about this framework, what's the path forward? Recognizing that at the end of the day, as you've said in different contexts, we have an enormous investment in each other's success and in maintaining a framework for robust collaboration.
Indeed, thank you very much. So I think the reality is that we all have shared objectives, whether it is the US industry, the EU importers, the governments. We would all like to have a cleaner value chain, a cleaner production, including a reduction of CO2 emissions. We know that there are things that can be done in the oil and gas sector, and that very often these investments make sense. Methane resulting from the fossil production is a value, and to the extent we can capture it and use it, then that makes sense also from a business perspective. We also have a shared objective in making sure that the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership is not slowed down or hindered by, certainly not by obstacles, but even by irritants that create uncertainty or risks. And so our approach is to make sure that the way we implement the regulatory frameworks is one that is conducive to our trade and investment relations, and one that does not stand in the way. In order to prepare for that, to secure that avenue, what we've been doing over the last few years is to have, over the last year or so, to have very, very close dialogue with US LNG exporters and companies, the European importers, really technical conversations in Washington and Brussels, online, to look at, well, what are the issues, what are the concerns, what are the challenges, and that has allowed us to have a very, very clear understanding of that, a mapping of that, and also to identify the pathway, how do we best implement our regulation in a way that works. So that's what we're working on now. We've good meetings with the US administration, including Secretary Wright, and so I'm confident that we can implement it and will implement it, the methane regulation, in a way that doesn't constitute an irritant in any way. We have, as you also mentioned, the CSDDD, which has given rise to, I think, a lot of questions. What we have done there is already now including it in one of our simplification proposals that is ongoing, and so that is addressing the questions relating to the CSDDD. So in other words, there's a clear road ahead. The methane regulation is in the implementation, making sure we do it right and we do it in a way that doesn't constitute a barrier or even an irritant. And for the CSDDD, that's part of our ongoing simplification drive. We have an interest in that simplification ourselves as well. Our industry, our investors have an interest in that simplification. At the same time, we, of course, making sure that we have the stable and predictable regulatory framework so that there's clarity for investments in Europe.
Good. Last question from my side, and we're going to be taking questions from the audience, so please do think of questions you'd like to raise your hands, and also online at ac.org. Quickly on nuclear. You talked about AI. I mean, this has transformed the conversation here in the United States around the future of the nuclear industry. It's been a priority for Secretary Wright. I've lost track of how many developers we now have working on SMR concepts, along with our traditional reactor construction and engineering companies that are also moving ahead swiftly. Talk a little bit about the debate in Europe, and how is this filtering there? And Europe spans the spectrum from France, a global nuclear power, and then other countries, other member states that have chosen to reject nuclear power. Where do you see that debate proceeding, and is it influenced, as it is here in the United States, by this super cycle of energy demand that we are seeing because of AI, heating, what Fatih Birol calls the electrification of everything?
Indeed, indeed. The context is very much one of electrification, a need for more clean energy in our systems, more electricity supply, and nuclear is very much part of that. Now, if I take it a step back, I think the debate around nuclear that you've seen in Europe sometimes overshadows the fact that we actually have a common treaty, the Euratom Treaty. All 27 European member states are signatories, a part of the treaty, and we cooperate among 27 on nuclear safety, safeguards, investments. That cooperation, that strong treaty-based framework, has been very stable and solid over, ever since its inception. So that is there. Then, linked to that, you have a question of the choices around energy mix. It's a national decision. It's a decision for national governments to decide what is the exact energy mix they want. Do they want nuclear in that mix or not? For some European countries, it makes sense to have nuclear power generation. For others, they have chosen not to have the power generation, but nonetheless importing nuclear-generated energy. So in that sense, nuclear is very much an integral part of our energy system and will remain an integral part of our energy system. Our forecast for what will the European common energy mix look like over the coming decades very, very clearly identifies nuclear as a necessary power supply source, with need for investments, both in terms of lifetime extensions over the coming decades, but also extension into new plants. And you will have seen a number of national governments having decided to step into nuclear, even if they haven't had it as part of their mix so far, or decided to expand and invest more in nuclear. So I would say a very constructive debate around nuclear in Europe, a debate that recognizes nuclear as part of the energy mix, a necessary part of the energy mix going forward. What we have done to try to help that is a number of initiatives, and I won't mention all of them, but just a couple. The first one is Our Euratom Treaty requires or allows for us to come forward with an investment plan for nuclear, really to identify what are the investments needed and where are they needed. We came out with the first draft earlier this year. It's now going through the political debate and discussions with a view to coming with the final plan on investments next year. So really getting an overview of what is needed, where is it needed. We, of course, have also looked at the small modular reactor space and have built the Small Modular Reactor Alliance, and will be coming out with an SMR strategy. Fusion is another part of it. We're also coming out with a strategy for that. So quite a lot happening in the nuclear space. And as you are saying, really very much part of the energy policy and energy supply response to an increasing demand, increasing electrification, including all of the AI-driven increases in demand.
Good, and I should also point out a natural area of synergy in the transatlantic relationship.
Absolutely.
New build by traditional reactors in Poland, Bulgaria, et cetera, SMRs in Romania, and then investments here in the United States. We had this week's announcement by E&I and their partners at Commonwealth on fusion and an offtake agreement there. So one more arrow in the quiver. Questions? Anybody want to? Please.
Hello. Hi, Madam Director. Jay Kansara here. We mentioned, the big powers of the world, China, Russia, and of course America, but given the attention that President Trump has put on India and its purchase of Russian oil, what is the European attitude towards that, and what are potential areas of partnership with India that can be helpful in alleviating concerns?
I think the first of all, at a more general level, the international partnerships and cooperation are necessary for all of us. As you said, President von der Leyen, in her State of the Union speech just a few weeks back, spoke of this moment of independence, but she was also very clear that independence does not mean isolation. Independence means resilience, working with others, but doing it in a way that keeps us secure and strong. And then coming to the India question specifically, India is obviously part of that, part of a group of important partners globally where we have a close cooperation and where we're trying to further strengthen the preparation. What you will see in the European strategy is a readiness to engage with partners, including in the field of trade and investment. We just yesterday concluded talks with Indonesia around a trade agreement. We've got a number of other negotiations ongoing, including a trade negotiation with India. So I think we would expect to see a further strengthened partnership also between the European Union and India, and see significant potential and interest there on both sides. Obviously, the conversation will have to reflect the geopolitical realities and challenges and see how do we best approach them together. But we are very much, as a European Union, we're very much open for business, open for investments, and open for partnerships and negotiating clear frameworks forward.
Great. We've got a room full of questions here, but also askac.org is still live. But here in the center, please.
I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at Commonwealth Fusion Systems.
Okay.
So,
I didn't know that.
The mention, you didn't even know I was here. Yeah, and I appreciate the mention of the hard work that's happening on the fusion strategy. We appreciate the effort. I did have a quick question as you think about the fusion strategy. I realize it's a member-driven decision in the European Union on how you proceed, but we've seen some good precedent around fusion strategy in the UK, in the US, Canada now pursuing a fusion strategy, Japan, and in the EU, Germany and Italy. So there are some member states, but also other global countries moving forward with thinking about how fusion is very distinct and different than fission. And what does that mean for a regulatory environment? How much work is done to kind of do benchmarking outside the member states and think about some of the global precedent like the US, the UK, and some of the other announcements that have been happening? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on that recent announcement. I think very, very good news. And again, as you've said, a sign of transatlantic partnership and cooperation. As we are developing the next stage of we are obviously looking for inspiration wherever inspiration can be. So those that are thank you very much. Those that are further advanced or have done more work on their strategies, we're looking at that for inspiration to see what can we draw on there. As you've said, a number of European member states are engaged in this, and we'll be drawing on that. We will be drawing on international cooperation in the ITER project and what we have there. And then, as you say, we do need to look at, well, the distinguishing features of fusion compared to traditional nuclear energy. What does that then mean for the regulatory framework, for safety, safeguards, to make sure that we simplify and facilitate as much as possible the developments that we would like to see being part of our energy system. So I can't be more concrete or specific because it is work in progress. Those considerations that you point to are important in developing the strategy.
Great, exciting times. Last question.
I'm Chris Fitzgerald from Octopus Energy, a clean tech company in the UK, but with over 2 million European customers. And if I may just humbly applaud everything that the Commission has done over the last few years in a number of areas. There's two that I'd like to just ask about. One was there is a commitment from the Commission to affordable electricity for consumers. And I wondered if you could just explain a little bit about how you're approaching that question, including with relation to flexibility and grids, etc. And the second is, Ambassador, you mentioned Ditte and Ukraine. We are actually working with them in Ukraine on installing solar and storage for commerce and industry to help Ukraine grow back. I know that the Commission has encouraged private sector investment and wondered if you had advice for those of us who are looking to operate in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. So on the first question of affordable electricity, what we see in developments and in markets now is that, first of all, electricity markets are more complex with the higher levels of electrification, with different technologies coming in. It simply is more complex to manage these systems to ensure the stability of the systems. We can also see that there's been a lot of focus on the generation investments, but insufficient focus on storage, flexibility, grids, and all the other aspects of the energy system. So we are catching up. We will be coming forward with a number of strategies, both on grids, on investments, on electricity markets, on storage, on heating and cooling, so all of those different parts of the system to see how do we best benefit from electrification and how do we do it in a way that keeps prices at check, but also help lower the burden on consumers. Now, some of that we've already done in our electricity market design, and without being super technical about it, we have a common electricity market, 27 countries, fairly well integrated. We can lower costs and lower prices if we further invest into the interconnections and into the functioning of that market. We can lower the losses of curtailment and other parts if we have more storage, more flexibility, more demand response. And then we can look at the price-setting mechanisms. Our functioning wholesale market is critical for our electricity security. But we can do more for the retail price levels, including long-term power purchasing agreements or contracts for difference. And so we're working to facilitate that and roll more of that out. I think at the same time, it is important to recognize that there is a lot of investments needed as part of the transition. And so the return on investments, the tariffs of the system, to make sure that those parts of the regulatory system function as well and that they do not become a burden is an important part of the energy affordability. So the short version is more complex in today's energy world, in a more electrified world. I think we have good instruments and we do benefit from being 27 interconnected countries with one electricity market, and there's a lot of gains to be had from that if we work more closely together and if we're ready to take the decisions to draw the full benefits. And Ukraine is very much part of that. You will certainly remember that at the time of the Russian invasion, we were actually, Ukraine was doing a test synchronization with the European system, and that test became a reality. And so Ukraine and Moldova are fully synchronized with the European system. That is the physical electricity reality. In addition to that, they are part of the energy community. They are a country on their way to become members of the European Union with everything that entails. And I guess that is one consideration, is investing in Ukraine, working with Ukraine, knowing that with their full membership and with their full integration into the European Union, that will further facilitate those investments and that business in Ukraine. There's still some work to be done in developing some of those sectors and some of that infrastructure, but I think you will see a lot happening also linked to the enlargement. Another important aspect of the Ukrainian energy system is the significant potential in biomethane and biomass. We have seen quite a few investments there and quite a lot of interest there. So I think in all parts of the energy system, Ukraine and the cooperation with Ukraine will bring benefits to all, and hopefully in a secure and peaceful Ukraine as soon as possible.
Good. Well, that's a terrific way to end an incredibly rich conversation that I think also highlights the degree to which energy cooperation has become a central pillar of the transatlantic relationship. And that's something that's going to play itself out over the years ahead. So very excited, grateful to you, Director General, for the conversation. Your team in Brussels, also Francesco and all the great folks at the EU mission in Washington. There is a lot that we can build on here, and I know the Atlantic Council looks forward to being part of that. Special thanks also to my friend and colleague, Olga Hakova, who's somewhere out here, who has put this event together, and there is no greater champion of these issues in the whole Washington ecosystem. And then finally, just encourage everybody, stay tuned to what the Atlantic Council is doing this week in New York. It's really exciting for me that there's so much focus on these energy and climate issues around the larger high-level week of the UN General Assembly. And then this conversation, for those of you who want to tune back, will be posted on the Atlantic Council websites, and look forward to continuing it in Brussels, Washington, or who knows where. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending our panel discussion. We ask that everyone now exit the ballroom and proceed to the foyer. We will be conducting a security sweep for our following event. Please exit the ballroom and proceed to the foyer. Thank you.